The year is 1897, and if you were to stand on the banks of the Thames in London, you would be standing at the undisputed centre of the human universe. The air is a thick, yellow fog of coal smoke and sea salt, a soup of industry that smells of wealth and progress. On this day, the streets are a sea of red, white, and blue. It is the diamond jubilee of Queen Victoria, a woman who has become less of a monarch and more of a living monument to an era. As her carriage rolls through the heart of London, she is flanked by a procession that seems to defy the laws of geography. There are the tall, bearded Sikhs of the Indian cavalry, their medals glinting in the pale English sun. There are the frontiersmen from the Canadian wilderness, the Maori from New Zealand, and the Hausa scouts from the sweltering forests of West Africa. To the millions watching, this is not just a parade, it is a visual inventory of a planet owned by a single small island. At this moment, the British Empire is a colossus. It covers nearly a quarter of the Earth's land surface. From the frozen tundras of the Yukon to the sun-scorched outback of Australia. From the dense, humid jungles of Malaya to the grand, ancient cities of the Indian subcontinent. The British flag flies over every conceivable climate and culture. It is a world where a businessman in London can wake up, drink tea grown on his own plantations in Darjeeling, wear a suit made of cotton harvested in Egypt, and read a newspaper printed on paper from the forests of Newfoundland. This is the era of the Pax Britannica, the British peace, where the oceans have become private highways for the Royal Navy. The world's economy is anchored to the pound sterling, a currency so stable it is considered as reliable as the Earth's rotation. But how did a rain-swept island on the fringes of Europe, once a mere outpost of the Roman Empire, manage to achieve what Caesar and Napoleon could only dream of? The answer wasn't found in the halls of Parliament, but in the cold, grey waters of the Atlantic. To understand the rise, we must look back to a time when Britain was an underdog, a nation of pirates and risk-takers. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the British were the outsiders looking in. The Spanish and Portuguese had already carved up the New World, their galleons heavy with Aztec gold and Incan silver. The British had no such luck. Instead, they had to be smarter, faster, and more ruthless. They began as privateers, a polite word for state-sponsored pirates, preying on Spanish treasure ships. Men like Francis Drake were the architects of this early aggression, proving that a small, fast ship with a well-trained crew could humiliate an empire. This maritime aggression soon evolved into something far more sophisticated, the corporate empire. This is the great secret of the British rise. It wasn't always the government leading the way, it was the merchants. The East India Company was, for all intents and purposes, a nation-state disguised as a business. It had its own army, larger than that of most European kings. It had its own currency. It had the power to declare war and negotiate treaties. By the mid-17th century, this company had effectively hijacked the Indian subcontinent, transforming it from a collection of powerful princely states into a giant profit-generating machine for shareholders in London. This was a new kind of power, not just the power of the sword, but the power of the ledger and the contract. Then came the fire. While the rest of the world was still tied to the slow rhythms of the seasons and the strength of animal muscle, Britain unlocked the power of the deep earth. The Industrial Revolution was the rocket fuel that propelled the empire into the stratosphere. With coal and steam, Britain became the workshop of the world. In the dark, satanic mills of Manchester and Leeds, they produced textiles and steel at a speed and scale that broke the global market. They didn't just want colonies for the sake of land, they wanted them as capturing markets. They needed raw cotton from the American South and India to feed the mills, and then they needed those same people to buy the finished shirts back. It was a perfect predatory circle of commerce, enforced by the most terrifying military force ever to sail, the Royal Navy. By the mid-19th century, the British Navy followed a two-power standard. It had to be larger and more powerful than the next two largest navies in the world combined. This wasn't just about vanity, it was about survival. The empire was a sprawling, fragile web of trade routes, and the navy was the glue that held it together. from the Rock of Gibraltar to the tip of Africa at Cape Town, from the gateway of the Red Sea at Aden to the island fortress of Singapore, the British occupied the choke points of the planet. If you wanted to move goods from one side of the world to the other, you did so by British permission, on British ships, insured by British banks. To understand the true nature of this machine, we have to travel back before the steam engines, before the Victorian pride, to a time when the Atlantic was not a British lake, but a vast, terrifying graveyard. In the 17th century, the British Empire was not a grand design. It was a desperate gamble. On the rocky shores of North America and the sweltering islands of the Caribbean, English settlers were clinging to life. They weren't soldiers of an empire yet. They were religious outcasts, gold seekers, and starving peasants who had been pushed off their own land back home. But in these scattered outposts, the British were discovering the formula for a new kind of power: the extraction of wealth through the mastery of the tides. This was the era of mercantilism, a cold-blooded economic theory that treated the world as a zero-sum game. The logic was simple. There is only a finite amount of gold in the world, and for Britain to have more, someone else must have less. To fuel this, the British government passed the Navigation Acts, a series of laws that acted like a stranglehold on global trade. Any product grown or manufactured in a British colony had to be carried on a British ship, sold in a British port, and taxed by a British king. It was a closed loop designed to drain the world's resources and concentrate them in the counting houses of London. But the engine of this growth was fueled by a darkness that the later Victorian histories would try to scrub clean. The rise of the British Empire was inseparable from the triangle trade. Ships left Liverpool and Bristol laden with manufactured goods, guns, cloth, and iron, which were traded on the African coast for human beings. These men, women, and children were packed into the stifling, diseased holds of ships for the Middle Passage, destined for the sugar plantations of Jamaica and Barbados. Sugar was the oil of the 18th century. It was a luxury that became a necessity, a high-calorie fuel for the working classes of Europe. The immense profits from the blood-soaked soil of the Caribbean didn't just build grand manor houses in England. They funded the very banks and insurance markets that would later bankroll the Industrial Revolution. The empire was being built on a foundation of forced labor and creaking timber. By the mid-1700s, Britain had successfully fought a series of global wars against the French and the Spanish, culminating in the 7 Years' War, what many historians call the real First World War. From the heights of Quebec to the plains of India, the British were victorious. They had kicked the French out of North America and established themselves as the dominant power in the East. But victory came with a price tag that would nearly shatter the young empire. The British treasury was empty, and the government in London looked across the ocean at their American colonists and saw a piggy bank. This was the moment of the first great fracture. The 13 colonies in North America had grown wealthy and self-sufficient under the salutary neglect of the Crown. They had their own legislatures, their own newspapers, and their own sense of identity. When London tried to impose taxes on tea, on paper, on legal documents, it wasn't just the money that bothered the colonists, it was the principle. They were being governed by a parliament 3,000 miles away in which they had no voice. The British, convinced of their own legal and moral right to rule, responded not with diplomacy, but with the bayonet. The American Revolution was a trauma that the British establishment never expected. It was a civil war within the English-speaking world. For 8 long years, the world's most powerful military struggled to suppress a ragtag army of farmers and merchants. When the British finally surrendered at Yorktown in 1781 and officially recognized American independence in 1783, the world thought the British Empire was over. It was a humiliating total defeat. The first British Empire had collapsed. The map had been torn up, but empires, like corporations, are capable of radical pivots. Instead of retreating, the British elite doubled down. They looked at the loss of America not as a reason to stop, but as a reason to change direction. If they couldn't rule the West, they would dominate the East. They shifted their gaze toward the ancient, wealthy lands of the Orient. This was the birth of the Second British Empire. They began to transform Australia from a distant coastline into a vast penal colony, a place to dump the surplus population of their crowded industrial cities. More importantly, they accelerated their takeover of India. No longer content with just trading tea and silk, the British East India Company began to act like a sovereign predator. Through a mixture of brilliant diplomacy, outright bribery, and the terrifying efficiency of the sepoy armies, local Indian soldiers trained in European tactics, the company began to swallow Indian King Dom's whole. By the early 1800s, the loss of America was a distant memory, replaced by the staggering wealth of the Ganges Valley. The British had learned their lesson. They would no longer rely on settlers of their own blood who might demand rights and representation. In the new empire, they would rule as a distinct, superior caste over subject races. They were no longer just building a home away from home. They were building a global hierarchy. And as the Napoleonic Wars reached their climax in 1815, with the British standing victorious at Waterloo, the island nation realized it had no rivals left. The blueprint was complete, the world was open, and the most aggressive phase of human expansion was about to begin. But as the mid-19th century approached, the British began to make a fatal mistake. They started to believe their own propaganda. They truly believed that they were not just masters of the world, but its teachers. In the grand offices of Whitehall, bureaucrats spoke of the civilizing mission. The idea that British law, the English language, and the Christian faith were gifts they were generously deeding to the darker corners of the earth. But on the ground, in the dust of the Indian plains and the villages of Africa, the reality was far more cynical. The empire was a giant vacuum cleaner, designed to suck up raw materials and labor, leaving behind just enough infrastructure to keep the machine running. And in 1857, that machine hit a wall of fire. The Indian Rebellion of 1857, often called the Sepoy Mutiny, was the moment the mask of the gentlemanly empire slipped. It began not with a grand political declaration, but with a rumor about Greece. The sepoys, the native Indian soldiers who made up the backbone of the British military in the East, were issued new Enfield rifles. To load them, a soldier had to bite the end off a cartridge that was rumored to be greased with cow and pig fat. To the Hindus, the cow was sacred. To the Muslims, the pig was an abomination. In a single stroke, the British had insulted the deepest soul of their entire army. But the grease was just the spark. The fuel was decades of land seizures, high taxes, and a growing sense that the British intended to erase Indian culture and replace it with a pale Victorian imitation. When the sepoys in Meerut turned their guns on their British officers, the explosion was instantaneous. Northern India descended into a nightmare of medieval violence. The British were caught completely off guard. In the city of Cawnpore, hundreds of British women and children were massacred, their bodies thrown into a well. The news sent a shockwave of primal rage through London. The civilized British responded with a savagery that matched and then exceeded the rebels. They didn't just execute the mutineers, they staged macabre spectacles of power, strapping rebels to the mouths of cannons and blowing them into a red mist. They burned entire villages. They hung men by the thousands along the roadsides. The rebellion was eventually crushed, but the British Empire that emerged from the smoke was different. The East India Company, the corporate monster that had ruled India for 250 years, was abolished. The British Crown took direct control, and Queen Victoria was declared Empress of India. This was the birth of the British Raj, a massive, cold and rigid bureaucracy. But the trust was gone forever. The British stopped trying to reform India and instead focused on absolute control. They built thousands of miles of railroads and telegraph lines, not to help the Indian people, but to move troops faster if another rebellion ever broke out. They lived in cantonments, walled-off military towns, segregated from the people they ruled. India had become a captive giant, held down by a thin web of steel and fear. While India was being hammered into submission, the British turned their eyes toward Africa. This was the scramble. a frantic, undignified land grab where European powers sat in a room in Berlin and drew lines on a map of a continent they had barely explored. Britain's ambition was Cape to Cairo, a continuous line of British territory running the entire length of Africa. They crushed the Zulu at Ulundi. They broke the Mahdi's army in the Sudan with the terrifying rattle of the first Maxim machine guns. But the further they pushed, the more the cost began to spiral. The true turning point, the moment the spirit of defiance proved that even white European-descended people wouldn't tolerate the British boot, was the Boer War at the turn of the century. In South Africa, the British found themselves fighting the Boers, Dutch-descended farmers who were as stubborn and well-armed as any British soldier. To win, the world's greatest empire had to resort to a scorched earth policy. They burned the Boers' farms, killed their livestock, and pioneered a terrifying new invention: the concentration camp. Thousands of Boer women and children died of disease and starvation in these camps, and for the first time, the British public began to question the morality of their own empire. The Boer War was a dirty war that stripped the empire of its prestige. It showed the world that the British military was slow, inefficient, and capable of extreme cruelty against other Europeans. It was a wake-up call. The British realized they were overstretched. They were defending a global house of cards with a military that was tired and a treasury that was starting to feel the strain. More importantly, the news of British struggles in Africa was being read with great interest in the coffee houses of Cairo and the universities of Calcutta. Young Indian lawyers like Mohandas Gandhi, who was serving as a stretcher-bearer in South Africa, were watching. They were seeing that the British were not gods. They were men who could be bled, who could be shamed, and who could be outlasted. The spirit of defiance was no longer just about sudden, violent mutinies. It was evolving into something far more dangerous to an empire: organized, intellectual, and nationalistic movements. The British had spent the 19th century teaching the world how to be modern, and now the world was going to use those same modern ideas of liberty and self-determination to demand the one thing Britain wasn't prepared to give: their freedom. The century of the empire was ending, and the century of the nation was about to begin, signaled by the distant, thunderous drums of a war in Europe that would change everything. In 1914, the world that the British had built, a world of steam, gold, and absolute certainty, collapsed into the mud of the Western Front. The Great War was supposed to be a short, glorious adventure, but it became a meat grinder that consumed the very foundations of the empire. For the first time, the blood tax was collected on a global scale. From the dusty villages of the Punjab to the sheep stations of Australia and the Canadian prairies, millions of men were funneled into the trenches of Flanders and the cliffs of Gallipoli. They fought and died for a king they had never met and a mother country many had never seen. Britain emerged victorious in 1918, and on paper, the empire was larger than ever, having swallowed the remains of the Ottoman and German territories. But the map was a lie. The gold that had once made London the world's vault had vanished, spent on millions of artillery shells and the debt owed to a new titan, the United States. The interwar years were a long, agonizing twilight. In 1921, the British were forced to accept the independence of the Irish Free State, a violent amputation right on their doorstep that proved the empire could be broken. In India, the massacre at Amritsar in 1919, where British troops fired into a crowd of unarmed protesters, had turned the jewel in the crown into a ticking time bomb. The myth of the benevolent ruler was dead, replaced by a desperate, paranoid grip on power. The British were now a debtor nation, struggling to maintain a global military on a bankrupt budget, while new rivals, Japan in the East and Germany in Europe, watched the aging lion with hungry eyes. Then came 1939 and the final catastrophic blow. If the First World War drained Britain's blood, the Second World War shattered its spine. In 1942, the world watched in disbelief as Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East and the symbol of British invincibility in Asia, fell to the Japanese. It was a humiliation from which the empire would never recover. It shattered the myth of European racial superiority forever. In the jungles of Burma and the deserts of North Africa, the British were no longer fighting for empire. They were fighting for survival. To keep the lights on, Winston Churchill was forced to sign the Lend-Lease Act, effectively mortgaging the empire's future to the United States. By 1945, the victory bells rang over a London that was a landscape of ruins. Britain was broke, exhausted, and irrelevant. The world of 1945 belonged to Washington and Moscow, not London. The British people, shivering in their unheated homes and living on rations, no longer had the stomach or the coins to play the role of global policemen. They had fought a war against Nazi tyranny in the name of freedom, and they could no longer look their colonial subjects in the eye and tell them they were not ready for the same liberty. The moral high ground had been traded for survival, and the financial cost of keeping hundreds of millions of people in subjection was now an impossible luxury. The empire was a ghost, a hollow shell of Victorian dreams waiting for the first gust of wind to blow it all away. The sun was no longer setting. It had already slipped below the horizon, and the darkness of a new post-imperial world was rushing in to fill the void. The year is 1947, and in the grand echoing halls of the Viceroy's Palace in New Delhi, the clock is not just ticking, it is racing. For 300 years, India had been the beating heart of British power, the source of its prestige, and the engine of its wealth. But the Britain that emerged from the smoke of the Second World War was a shadow of its former self. It was a nation of breadlines and debt, no longer able to afford the immense cost of policing a subcontinent on the verge of explosion. Lord Mountbatten, the last viceroy, was sent with a single desperate mission: get out and get out fast. The departure was not a planned transition, it was a frantic retreat. On the 15th of August, the Union Jack was lowered, and two new nations, India and Pakistan, were born in a tidal wave of blood. The partition displaced 15 million people and killed over 1 million more in a frenzy of sectarian violence. The jewel in the crown had been torn out, and with it the moral and logical foundation of the British Empire vanished. If the loss of India was a mortal wound, the Suez Crisis of 1956 was the public funeral of British superpower status. For decades, the British had viewed the Suez Canal as the jugular vein of their empire, the vital link between London and the oil fields of the East. When the Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the canal, the British Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, reacted with the old imperial reflex. He sent the troops. It was meant to be a show of strength, a signal that Britain still ruled the waves. Instead, it was a catastrophe. The United States, Britain's closest ally and its primary creditor, was furious. President Eisenhower threatened to collapse the British pound if they did not withdraw. In a single night, the hierarchy of the world was made clear. Britain was no longer a player in the Premier League of global powers. They were a junior partner, a nation that could no longer act without the permission of Washington. The humiliation at Suez sent a message to every nationalist leader from Nairobi to Kingston. The old lion had lost its teeth. The 1960s became the decade of the wind of change. It was a phrase coined by Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, a recognition that the spirit of nationalism was sweeping across Africa like a forest fire. One by one, the flags came down. Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda. The map that had once been so proudly pink was turning into a mosaic of new identities. In many places, the transition was peaceful, a polite exchange of keys and handshakes. In others, like Kenya and Rhodesia, it was a bitter, bloody struggle against settlers who refused to believe the era of white supremacy was over. By the time the 1970s arrived, the British Empire had effectively ceased to exist as a political entity, replaced by the Commonwealth, a loose association of independent states held together by the English language, the game of cricket, and a shared, often painful history. The final symbolic act of this long withdrawal took place on a rainy night in June 1997. In the gleaming, neon-lit harbour of Hong Kong, the British gave up their last major colonial possession. Prince Charles stood in the rain as the Union Jack was folded for the last time to the sound of bagpipes. It was the end of a 500-year story. The British Empire was officially over, leaving behind a world that it had fundamentally reshaped in its own image. Its legacy is written in the skylines of Singapore and Dubai, in the legal codes of 5 continents, and in the fact that you are likely listening to this story in the English language. But the legacy is also written in the scars. It is in the arbitrary borders drawn in the sand that still cause wars in the Middle East and Africa today. It is in the deep, unresolved traumas of colonization and the vast wealth gap between the West and the global South. Today, Britain is a small island nation again, still grappling with the ghost of its imperial past. It is a country that once owned the world and now struggles to find its place within it. The monuments to the men who built the empire still stand in the squares of London, but they are increasingly viewed with a critical, questioning eye. The empire was a machine of incredible efficiency and unspeakable cruelty, a bringer of technology and a thief of resources, a creator of the modern world and a destroyer of ancient ones. The sun has finally set on the British Empire, but the heat of that sun still lingers in the politics, the conflicts, and the cultures of the 21st century. The story of the empire is not just a story of the past, it is the blueprint of the present. As we look at the ruins of this colossal structure, we are forced to ask, was the price of this global order worth the cost of the humanity it crushed along the way? The answer depends entirely on which side of the ocean you are standing on. The story of the British Empire is a mirror held up to humanity, reflecting both our greatest ambitions and our deepest flaws. From a tiny island to a global colossus and back again, it remains one of history's most profound lessons. It is a reminder that no power, no matter how vast, is permanent, and that the tides of history eventually wash over even the grandest of monuments. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the rise and fall of an empire. If you found this exploration of history compelling, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the stories that shaped our world. Your support allows us to keep telling these stories. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.